My name is Kira Stubbs. I'm a second-year law student at Penn State Law, working with the Manglona Lab for Gender and Economic Equity. For the lab's Witnesses to History project, we are capturing the personal experiences of women during a dynamic era in the United States. Today, I have the privilege of welcoming Judge Angela Mazzarelli, who's agreed to share her story as part of this project. Throughout her life, Judge Mazzarelli has been a respected attorney, compassionate judge, and the longest-serving female justice in the Appellate Division of the New York State Supreme Court. Thank you, Judge Mazzarelli, for joining me.
Well, thank you for contacting me and having me. I think it's very important for women to talk about how they struggle to get along in the legal profession so that younger women will realize, I hope, that the struggle still is there. And if recent events don't prove that to you, then you're not listening.
Mhm. And so I want to start at the very beginning by asking you about your childhood in Massachusetts in the late 1940s and early 50s. So who did you live with growing up?
Oh, I lived with my family. I was one of five children. I was the fourth child in the line. And I had two parents, mother and father. And they, my mother was a homemaker. My father was a bread baker. Uh, his family had a bakery called the Mazzarelli Bakery. And I think it still exists, although it's not owned by anyone in the family. It hasn't been for many, many years. The town I grew up in was uh, mostly a farming, a dairy farming town at one time. The area I grew up in the town was a working class area, on the literally on the other side of the tracks. And there was some ethnic discrimination afoot in that area. Um, in fact, my mother was born in the town where I grew up, and they didn't use Italian names for birth records in those days. The clerk of the town changed everybody's name to either Irish or English names. My mother's name was Melchiorre, but on her birth certificate it was listed as Mitchell, and her whole family was called Mitchell, and that wasn't just for my mother, but for most of the other Italian American immigrants. They had anglicized names, not by choice. Something I don't think that would happen today, I hope. But so it was a little bit of a struggle. I did pretty well in school, I think, high school. Uh,
Oh, yeah. Yes, I absolutely want to get to school in a minute. But first, I wanted to ask who tended to make the household decisions, with your mom being a homemaker, your dad being a bread baker. Who made
my
those?
mother,
Your mother?
yeah, yeah, my mother made most of the household decisions, yeah. And it was a busy household, believe me, with five children and everybody. We were very education oriented in my family. We all went to college. Uh, my
Something your parents encouraged for all five children?
Yes, both of my sisters had graduate degrees also. My oldest sister, who just recently passed away, was a PhD in anthropology and an anthropology professor. Taught at Williams College and Wellesley State Community College, and very, very, for her time, an amazing woman. Really
Wow.
amazing. She was 9 years older than I am, so she was really quite a pioneer. And then my middle sister got an MBA at the University of Chicago uh, as a graduate degree. She was one of four women in her class, if you can believe that. Four women. Uh,
Wow. And
yeah.
what did she study, did you say?
She got a master's in business administration, and then she went to work for a consulting firm, and then she became an executive at Unilever for a while, an international company.
Wow.
Yeah.
We'll talk more about graduate school and so on. But first, back to elementary school. So you began attending elementary school in 1951, correct?
I think so, yes. I went to a one-room schoolhouse for the first year. There were three grades in one room. And I got in a lot of trouble in first grade because I was a little bored. I knew how to read, and you weren't supposed to like go ahead, and I would always go ahead. But I learned to read because everybody in the house was reading, my other siblings were all reading.
What
But
were
they
they all
closed,
reading?
huh?
Sorry. What
Well, they
were
were doing their
your siblings
schoolwork,
reading? Okay.
yeah, books, whatever. We had, now it looks to me like a small shelf of books, but we did have a couple of shelves of books, which in the neighborhood was quite a thing. Uh,
Do you remember any of the books that you read or that your siblings read?
well, my mother had bought this set of classics. Right now, I probably don't remember the names, but they were lots of, the famous classic books, and she also bought an Encyclopedia Britannica set, which I know she paid for monthly. But she wanted us to have that. Um, so
What do you mean she paid for it monthly? I guess I'm not familiar.
well, they would sell you the books, but you had to pay a man would come every month and collect the money. It was like an installment payment. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Wow. So you enjoyed school, I take it?
Somewhat, yeah, yeah. You
What-
went, that was it.
Yeah.
Know.
You attended public school, right?
Yes, I did. I attended public school.
And was a dress code required?
Oh, yes, yes, we had they were very strict. Uh, no jeans, no jean skirts, you had to have long skirts. Nobody wore pants. I mean, I'm jumping ahead a little bit, but I can remember the day that I wore a pantsuit to the appellate division. Uh, but
For
much
the first
later in time.
for the first time, that was when you were wearing pantsuits in the appellate division?
Yes, yeah. I was the first, well, there were only two women there anyway, but I wore a pantsuit, and you would think that the world was going to collapse with this pantsuit.
What do you mean by that?
Well, we ate lunch together, the judges did, and I walked into the lunchroom, and oh my God, I got this, what are what's going on, sort of kind of thing. And I was questioned about it, and of course, the more they asked, the more I got. I said, I'm going to wear it every day. Stop.
Who was in that lunchroom? Was it other
All the
judges?
other judges, yeah.
Were they mostly men or some female or women as well?
When I went to the appellate division, there were 14 men and 2 women in the court.
Okay.
And then at
You're the
one
first
time,
one to start wearing pantsuits as a woman,
yeah,
correct?
and then at one time, after the other woman retired, there's an age limit there. Um, and after she retired, I was the only woman there for 3 years, 15 men and me. So, but they were all nice to me. They none of them treated me in a disrespectful manner. So back to grammar school, or high school, whatever. Where were we?
Yes, we were still in grammar school. So you were
Yeah,
telling me that the girls had to wear long skirts. What did
not floor length, but you wore below your knee, and nobody wore a denim skirt, or it was almost, as I learned later, almost like a Catholic school code. You had to dress very appropriately. But nobody thought anything of that in those days. You just didn't. I mean, you did that. And then after my first grade, I had to take a school bus because we were sent to another town to go to another section of the town to go to school. And I did all, I just went to school. It was uneventful for the most part. Uh,
Mhm.
and in high school, I had to take a bus further because the town I lived in was a small town, and they had started a regional high school for 2 towns. So we took a school bus to the other town, about 10, 12 miles away.
Okay.
And that was I didn't fit in too well with most of the girls in the school because I don't want to compliment myself, but I was smarter than a lot of them, but I wasn't, I didn't come from the right ethnic background, and I wasn't, pretty and all that stuff. So, but I made it through school.
Meaning you were Italian, is that what you're?
Yes, yes,
Yeah.
I was Italian, and but I was in the high, they graded you or they separated you by how well you did in school. And I was in the top part of the school. And I always got the top grades.
Was it where you said that you felt like you didn't fit in? Was that mostly coming from the girls in your class that you felt like an outsider, or the boys?
Well, pretty much all of them,
Mm-hmm.
but I did have friends. I wasn't friendless there. There were some people I was friendly with, and it was pretty good. I mean, everybody in my family had gone to school there. The family was known. Um,
Mm-hmm.
uh, and my brother, who was younger than I am, my youngest brother, was a big football player. He was a very popular guy and very successful football player. So that helped me because I was his sister.
Mm-hmm.
He won one year, he won the big football game. He intercepted a pass and ran in the right. He said to me afterward, all I kept thinking was, I hope I'm going in the right direction. And he was. So that was nice. Uh,
In those early years, did you ever think about what you wanted to do when you grew up?
sure, yeah, I wanted to change the world and an impact on things. I wanted to become a lawyer when I was a kid. And then I sort of lost that and decided I wanted to become a historian because I read a lot of history books. I used to go to the library a lot. We were encouraged to do that.
And you were a history major in college, correct?
Yes, I was. Yeah.
So, when you initially decided you wanted to be a lawyer as a child, what inspired that?
Well, I used to listen to the news and read the newspapers, and I wanted to be. I kind of had an interest in politics, not so much that I was going to become a politician, but it interested me, and I was disturbed at the corruption things, and it was very, it was the time when I was a kid was a very tumultuous time. The country was changing, uh,
This was
and
this was the 50s, correct?
right, life
What
was changing. Desegregation was taking place, and you watched on television these terrible scenes of people being attacked with hoses, fire hoses, being beaten, and all of the discrimination in the South, and it was a very complex and disturbing experience for a kid. I mean, I can't even remember Joseph Stalin dying, and the whole thing about that. The world was the changes were very dramatic.
And you thought being a lawyer would put you in a position to address some of those
Yeah,
challenges?
yes.
Did you see anyone in your community or on TV, women doing that, being a lawyer?
I had a cousin who was a lawyer. She actually was the only lawyer I knew, and I wasn't particularly friendly with her or close to her. She actually had been my mother's friend when she was a child. They were about the same age. My mother came from a very large family. My mother was the youngest, and her mother was the second oldest, so they were actually close in age. But she had gone to a law school in Boston, which was called at that time Portia Law School. After Portia and uh, the Shakespearean character and the Merchant of Venice, and I think it's now called the New England Law School of Law. But so she was something of a role model, but I didn't have a really direct role model. I just knew I was going to go to college because everybody in my family went to college. Um, and that opens so many different things to you.
Was
When I went to a very good school, I went to Brandeis University. I had done very well on the SATs and National Honor Society, National, what was it, Merit Society? I forget the name of it.
Mhm. Yes. And we'll also get to college in a little bit, but first, I wanted to ask you about um, the other girls in your class. Did they, in grammar school, what did you hear them talking about that they wanted to do
I
after?
don't really remember them talking about what they wanted to do. There were
Mhm.
certain assumptions about what you were going to do. I remember I went to a high school reunion at one point, about 15 years after I had graduated from high school. By that time, let's see, I was already a lawyer, certainly, but I found it very interesting that only 1/3 of the people in my high school class had left that area. And most of them hadn't even gone out of New England. There were only a handful of us who had gone, outside of that area.
Mhm. Wow. Um, and okay, we'll move on to high school now. So you began high school in 1960, correct?
I guess so. I graduated in 64, so
And did you participate in any sports or extracurriculars during high school?
I was the manager of the basketball team. I was never particularly athletic, but I was the manager of the basketball team, and was I was in a couple of clubs. I was we did plays, and I was in the club that did the plays. So,
Okay.
yeah.
And what made you want to manage the basketball team?
It was fun. My sister was a basketball player, and you got to go on the bus to different places and see a lot of different things, and you got to cut classes, and it was a little variety.
So this was the girls' basketball team, correct?
Yeah, yeah.
And
But they had a field hockey team that I used to. I didn't play field hockey, but I went to some of those games.
so if you had wanted to play sports and you could have joined a team pretty easily.
Yeah, they had plenty of girls' sports.
And what drew you to theater?
I enjoyed the role playing very much, and I was pretty good at it actually. Yeah.
That's great.
And I guess later on, I remember that in the 80s there was a big thing about lawyers going to acting classes. That it was helpful to go to acting classes if you were a trial lawyer, and I thought that was pretty good because it is a little bit of acting.
It certainly seems like it, yes.
Yeah,
A
yeah.
little bit of a performance. And so did you get to choose your classes in high school? And did you graduate?
No,
Okay.
no, you didn't. We changed classes, but you went to every class that. I was in the honors program in high school, so I had to go to all the honors classes.
What was the composition of the boys and girls in the honors classes?
Oh, gee. I hadn't thought about some of these things for so long.
Was
Um,
it just like, was it mostly boys, mostly girls, or just kind of even?
50-50. I
Yeah.
don't think there was, yeah, wasn't, it was based on test scores. We had to take these things called the Iowa tests every year or something, and how well you did on those, and how well your grades were, how good your grades were rather.
So were there any classes that the girls were required to take and the boys were required to take, or all the same?
Well, there was one. The girls had to take home ec, and the boys had to take shop. They got to make things with wood and stuff like that. We had different sections. We had sewing, we had cooking, and I didn't mind that because I enjoyed both of those, and I knew how to do them anyway because my mother taught us uh, how to do that. She taught us all how to cook and how to sew a little bit and how to iron and stuff. She said girls needed to know that, and the boys did too in case they married a girl who didn't know how. So we all had that, and we had certain duties at home too. You know,
What kind of duties at home?
well, you had one week you were in charge of the ironing, and there were three girls, so every third week you had to do the ironing. And in those days, everybody ironed everything. They ironed undershirts my father's undershirts, his shorts that he wore. Everything was ironed. They ironed bras, if you can believe it. I don't know what you were going to do on ironing, but nobody irons now. I mean, I bet you don't iron, right?
No.
They ironed We had to iron the sheets.
Did your father and brothers iron or just your mother
No,
and
no.
sisters and you?
My brothers knew how to iron. My mother made sure of that. They knew how to iron, that they knew how to sew buttons and stuff like that. I convinced my mother, in those days you didn't have a clothes dryer either. You had to hang the clothes out on the line. I don't know if you've ever seen that or not. Have-
Yeah, I've seen that.
You've seen that?
Mhm.
Well, it used to be on Mondays, all the people did their ironing, but I convinced her that the sheets smelled better if you didn't iron them, that they smelled fresh. And they did. So we got off ironing the sheets, but we had to pretty much at first we had to iron all those. And then there were certain duties assigned for dinner. Like every night, everybody had, we called it supper, we didn't call it dinner. Sunday, we called it dinner, which was in the afternoon, but every night, everybody ate together, except for my father, who came home late from work. But one week, you had to set the table and clean up off the table, clean the table off, and sweep the floor. One week, you had to wash the dishes, and one week, you had to dry the dishes and put them away. So, and that rotated.
And you
So,
said that that was all the children or just your
no, the
brother,
girls, just the
just the girls?
girls.
Okay.
The
Were there
boys had to shovel the snow
okay.
and
And
do more of the outdoor work.
in high school, did you also like to read as much as you did in
Yes.
elementary
Yeah.
school?
Yeah, I read a lot of the books. Now you're gonna ask me what I read. A lot of I got into one year reading military history of the Civil War. I don't know why I got into that, but they had a bunch of books at the library about the Civil War and military movements. And I thought that was pretty interesting with the left flanks and the right flank. And I read a lot of those.
Mhm. Interested in history throughout high
Yeah,
school as well.
yeah, yes.
What about any magazines?
Well, they used to get Life magazine. One of my aunts, where I lived, my mother was one of seven children, and everybody in her family lived nearby. So I had lots of aunts and uncles in that area. So if one aunt got Life magazine, the rest of us didn't get it because we read hers. We got Time magazine, which was pretty good in those days.
Hmm.
Somebody else got Newsweek.
Hmm.
I liked Time better,
Hmm.
and
So
Life was a big deal. Huh?
mostly like news magazines.
Right. uh, Family Circle. Somebody got Family Circle, which was a women's magazine, which had a lot of recipes and things. But my parents were big newspaper readers.
Did
Uh,
your family talk about politics openly with each other?
Absolutely. My mother was a Republican, which in those days was very different than it is now. Uh, and particularly in Massachusetts, it was different. They were very liberal by today's standards. And my father was a Democrat.
Hmm.
And they would talk about it all the time, and everybody talked about it. We talked about everything. There were no, sometimes we had fights too at dinner, but
Hmm.
no holds barred in terms of conversation about politics.
Right.
But we always talked about politics. My mother was very active in politics.
She was. What did she
Yeah,
do?
there was a particular representative to the state House of Representatives that she knew and she supported and she liked, and she would work in his campaigns. And she was one of the people. My mother knew how to drive, which that may not seem like anything to you, but that was a big deal when my mother was a young woman. She was the only girl in her family who knew how to drive a car.
Really?
Yeah, and she was the only person in her family who graduated from high school. Uh,
Wow.
my mother wanted to be a nurse and actually got into nursing school, but her parents wouldn't let her go because it required that she sleep at the nursing school. And for an unmarried woman at that time, that was not proper in their minds. So I think that always played into her pushing her daughters to have a career.
What do you
But
mean it wasn't proper? Do you mean it wasn't safe or it wasn't, you know, looked like appropriate? Or can you explain
it
more what?
wasn't appropriate. Yeah.
Okay.
I don't, maybe it wasn't safe too, I don't know, but I would assume it would be safe. She would be sleeping at the school, but they didn't think that was acceptable
Mhm. So did your mom get involved in politics in the 50s when you were growing up or later?
in the 50s.
Okay.
Yeah.
So she had a lot of duties and responsibilities outside of the household, it sounds like.
She had some, yeah, yeah,
Mhm.
but she had a lot of duties inside the household with
Mhm.
5 children. And I
Yeah.
had a cousin who stayed there with us for a while. Uh, his mother had passed away and his father had remarried, and he didn't get on with his stepmother too well. So he
Mhm.
would show up once in a while.
Mhm.
But it was a busy household
Mhm.
because we all had friends in and out.
Mhm.
Yeah.
And so your mom, what kind of things did she do to help with the campaign?
What she did mostly was getting people to the polls. She had a list. That's why we started with the driving. She had a list of people that she had to drive to the polls. So every election she would call them up and tell them when she would pick them up, and she would drive them to where they had to vote and then bring them back. And she did that for the whole day. That was her main activity. But she was invited to the inauguration of the first Italian American governor of the state of Massachusetts. His name was John Volpe, and she had a great seat there too, and that was a big deal, a really big deal.
Wow. And so her help with the campaign and driving, not many women you said were driving at that time. Was she
Right,
the few women in the community who was driving?
yeah, right. She was the only, as I said, the only woman in her family who could drive,
Mhm.
and she used to drive my aunt. One of my aunts her husband had a very big car, and she would use his car because she could get a lot of people in it, drive drive around in that car.
Wow. Um, just another question about your household in during your high school years. Did you watch any shows or movies that stood out to you when you were a high schooler?
When I was in high school, we didn't have a television until probably I started junior high school. So if you wanted to look at anything on television, you had to go see one of your aunts because they had television sets. Um, but the television was off at, we were doing homework, so the television wasn't on. But
Mhm.
we would watch the news. My father would watch the Friday night fights at the Gillette. I remember that was the banging ding dong. That was a big deal. Um, and we would watch mostly holiday kinds of things, parades, New Year's Day and stuff. But every Monday night we watched I Love Lucy. That was a big treat. And but television wasn't that central to our lives like it is now.
Mhm. What is I Love Lucy about? I've
You
heard of
don't
it.
know I Love, did you ever hear of Lucille Ball?
Oh yes.
It's a wonderful comedy. There's also The Honeymooners with Jackie Gleason.
Okay, I'm not
Trust
familiar
me,
with that one.
take a look at it. I'm sure they're on some streaming channel now, but I Love Lucy. She was an incredible comedian, Lucille Ball, and Jackie Gleason was an incredible comedian. You know,
Mhm.
also very talented people. There
Mhm.
were some very good shows at that time,
Mhm.
but none of I don't remember too much about television. I didn't have a TV at college.
Mhm.
Somebody else did, and we would watch a few shows,
Mhm.
not too many.
So yeah, moving on to college now. You attended Brandeis University starting in 1964, correct?
Correct.
And you said you got a really high SAT score. You chose Brandeis. What influenced your decision to choose Brandeis?
Are you familiar with Brandeis?
I'm familiar. I know that the school was established to expand access and opportunities to some minority communities, including women. Did that play a role?
Well, it was minority communities, particularly Jewish people.
Jewish people
Right,
as
right.
well. Yep.
Yeah. Well, my oldest sister had gone to Brandeis and liked it very much. And I got into a few schools that I was interested, but I got a very good scholarship to Brandeis. And so I chose to go there. And it wasn't very far from where I lived, but I wasn't going to commute. My sister had commuted to school, and when I had an interview, I said, I'm not going to commute if I come here. I want to live on campus. And it was a great experience. Very, very nice experience. You have your ups and downs in school. You get lonely, you get a little homesick. It's a little hard to integrate. Most of the kids there were from New York and had different backgrounds than I had. The town I came from was a small town, 3,000 people. These kids came from New York City. They could talk. Like, man, could they talk? I was quite taken with that, how proficient they were in that. And it
What do you,
was
sorry, what
but
do you mean they could talk? They just talked a lot. They were good at talking.
yeah, they were very good at talking, yeah. Talking about things.
What did they talk about?
Everything that they had different backgrounds than I had. They had more experience with different groups of people and social settings and things of that nature. So, but I made friends there. I still my best friend from college, we're still in touch with each other. We don't see each other much, but we still consider each other friends, uh, which is nice.
Yeah. What was the composition of men and women in Brandeis at the time?
Oh, I think it was probably split 50-50.
Hmm.
Yeah.
And you were a history major and you got into history pretty early, right? So that was always something you had wanted to study.
Yes, it was. And I did pretty well. And we had some very prominent historians as professors. And actually, they convinced me not to go to a graduate school in history. They said that the only way you can make a living in history is to get a PhD and teach. And they said it's very hard to do that, particularly for women, and that you have to be exceptionally good at it. And they suggested that I could earn a living more easily as a lawyer, which had its own pitfalls too, but
Mhm.
um, sounded, it sort of went back to what I was thinking of anyway, doing as a kid. So I followed their advice. And Brandeis was very much an eye-opening place. It really challenged you intellectually, and there were some excellent professors who, that was within many people's memory, the Second World War and the terrible things that had happened, and that was part of what was going on there. And it was a very intellectually stimulating place to go to.
So you recall people talking about the social unrest a lot on campus? Students.
Oh yes, there was a lot of social unrest. We went to demonstrations. I remember one year I marched in the St. Patrick's Day parade with the this Catholic youth group that was in favor of desegregation. And we got everything thrown at us that you could imagine: beer, eggs, bagels, everything was thrown at us as we walked in that parade. It was the most unpleasant experience, but it was worthwhile.
Was this near Brandeis, this parade?
That was in Boston.
In Bo-
Boston. Yeah,
And this was during your college years, so that must have been between 1964 and 1968.
correct. It was a tumultuous time in this country. I graduated in 68 and I came to New York City, to Columbia, to go to law school. And Columbia, what went on then was very, tumultuous. And there were riots and demonstrations. And one year we had our exams suspended in the law school, which I took as a great relief.
What were the demonstrations about during your time in law school?
The
Was it also about desegregation?
Vietnam War.
Vietnam War. Oh yeah, this would have been late 60s and then early 70s.
I participated in a couple of famous demonstrations. The one on Wall Street. There was a big demonstration in Wall Street that is pretty well known and was very nasty group. We were treated very shabbily by the police, and uh, things again were thrown at us. And that was also a time when construction workers were very anti-demonstrators, uh, would yell at women with obscenities. And
Mhm. Did you demonstrate with many of your friends, or was this
oh
just
yeah,
part of the
yes.
men and
And we
women?
went, yeah, we went to Washington, march, couple of marches on Washington. We got tear gassed and
Oh my God.
a lot of things like that. And I remember a friend of my sister's let us sleep on her floor in her apartment
Wow.
uh, for a
So,
day.
so these were causes you were clearly very passionate about.
At that time, if you weren't passionate about those, the I don't know, nobody I knew wasn't passionate about them.
You were surrounded by like-minded people at
Yeah.
Brandeis and in Columbia.
Mhm. Columbia, there were a few less like-minded people. There was a group of people who were very focused on other things in their life. Uh, and they made a lot more money than I did in their career, but that was okay.
So, yeah, so moving on to law school, we touched on some of it. So, why did you choose Columbia Law? I know you mentioned earlier you received a scholarship. Was that the main reason why you chose Columbia?
Actually, I wanted to go to NYU. I got a good scholarship to NYU, but these professors who I knew and were mentors to me had been Columbia professors, and they urged me to go to Columbia, and I got a full scholarship to Columbia. But you should know that at that time, it had just been a law had just been passed which prohibited college schools from requiring a photograph with your application. It used to be that you had to provide a photograph, so they knew exactly your sex, your race, etc. So that helped to stop some discrimination. But I
So
got into,
sorry,
huh?
I was just going to clarify. So the first year that you applied to law school in 1968, that was the first year they stopped requiring the photograph for the application.
Yes, but they didn't stop requiring it for the second round for financial aid. And I got into a whole bunch of law schools, but I didn't get any financial aid from them.
But you did receive a full merit scholarship to Columbia, correct?
And to NYU,
And
yeah.
to NYU.
Yeah. Actually,
And
NYU gave me more money than I asked for. They gave me a little extra, which was nice of them, but then I didn't go. And then I decided that it was a mistake because NYU was a more fun place to be. It was in the village versus uptown, but I stayed at Columbia. But at that time also, law schools, there was one law school, very well recognized law school. You had to sign a loyalty oath with your
what does that
application.
entail?
That entailed that you were loyal to the United States and that you would not take any actions against the law. You wouldn't participate in demonstrations, stuff like that.
That
They don't
was
do that. They don't do that anymore, I bet.
and that was out of a concern with Vietnam protests. Is that right?
Yes. Yeah.
Uh,
There
the
was a lot of intensity in this country on that. People, they were very, you think we're split now. Well, we were split then too. Uh, pro, hawks versus doves. And it was very intense, very intense.
the who were the Hawks? Or
The
did you
hawks were the people in favor of the war that we had to prevail, and the doves were the ones who were against the war.
hmm And would you say it was divided mostly conservative, liberal, the
It's
split?
pretty much like it is now. I bet you the same people that are supporting one candidate now would have supported the war, and the same people who would have supported the other candidate now would have been the doves. I suspect that.
Mhm. So, can you first I wanted to ask the your professors at Brandeis who encouraged you to go to NYU Law, were they these mentor
They
type
they they encouraged me to go to Columbia.
or Columbia,
Yeah,
sorry.
yeah.
Okay. And okay, so they encourage you to go to Columbia. Were these women professors or
Men, two men.
two men?
At that time, now NYU is very highly regarded. At that time, it was on its way up, but Columbia was always, was a Ivy League law school, so it was always top notch. My family did not want me to go to New York to go to law school.
Why
Very
not?
well, New York was too far away. It was too dangerous. It was this and that. But my oldest sister had, when I was in high school, she had taken me to New York for one weekend, and I to see some Broadway shows. That was her present to me for graduating, and I just said, "I'm coming here, man. This is where I want to be."
What
And
made you think that?
I
Anything in
just
particular?
I loved it. I just liked the people. I walked everywhere. We took a bus, so we walked from Times Square. You don't know New York, but we walked from Times Square down the Village and all over the place. It was so fascinating to me. I had never seen an apartment.
Really?
Yeah. I mean, everybody I knew lived in a house.
Hmm.
Uh, you know, I never saw buses like that. I mean, I saw buses, but subway, oh my God, I never had seen a subway, you know.
I
And
actually
I
lived in New York City before coming to law school, so I know the feeling of getting there.
Where'd you live?
I lived in Gramercy.
Oh, that's a beautiful area.
I loved it. So I know the feeling of entering New York for the first time.
I don't live too far from there.
Oh, that's great. What neighborhood?
Murray Hill.
Oh, nice. Wonderful.
Yeah.
Um, so I was going to ask, could you walk us through the experience of receiving your full scholarship from Columbia? Um, sorry, sorry, let me start over that question because I stuttered a little bit. So I know you, okay, flip, okay. So
Take a breath.
so you mentioned you received a full scholarship to Columbia Law, and you had mentioned previously that there was a federal circuit scholarship program where one recipient from each federal circuit received a scholarship. Can you walk us through the experience of being honored with that scholarship at the cocktail party that you attended?
Oh, did I tell you that story about the cocktail party?
You mentioned it previously.
Well, there was a law firm called Sherman and Sterling who very generously gave 11 scholarships to Yale, where Sterling had gone to law school, and 11 scholarships to Columbia, where Sherman had gone to school. And I guess I was surmising that uh, pretty much it was guys who got those scholarships. And the year that I started law school, 68, the law school, for whatever reason, decided to diversify the recipients a little bit. And we were not all men. So, and the firm had a cocktail party for the recipients. So we got on this bus and we drove, I don't know where we drove, some fancy place uh, outside of Manhattan, and lovely place. And I go to up, we're going in, and I ask, for my name tag, and the person said, "Well, where's your husband?" I said, "I'm Angela Mazzarelli." She said, "Well, where's your husband?" I said, "Don't have a husband. What was I going to do with a husband at that age anyway?" I said, "I don't have a husband." She said, "Well, where's the scholarship recipients?" I said, "I'm the scholarship recipient. Me, Angela." Well, this caused a bit of a stir, and I think that was the last cocktail party they gave. But
And you
they gave me the scholarship, so I have no complaints.
and you mentioned they assumed your name was Angelo Mazzarelli.
That's right.
So how did that interaction make
That
you?
happened to me more than once. That was, I think, some law schools when I was applying, that happened. And if we get to it, I'll tell you another story about being someone thinking my name was Angelo, uh,
Mhm.
which is really shocking story to me anyway. But
That's the story when the law professor approached you, correct?
right,
Yeah.
that's right, that's
And
right.
we'll get to that
Yeah.
because I would love to hear that story. Um, so at that cocktail party, did anyone else overhear that conversation?
Yeah, some of the other students, and that's ridiculous.
Were the
So
other students men or women?
Most of them were men, and there were a couple of African American students there, and I think that they were a bit of a surprise too. But
Mhm.
uh, nobody was rude to anybody. Everybody was nicely treated. Uh,
In your class at Columbia, what was the composition of men and women students?
10% of the 11% of the class was women. Columbia, I think, was the first Ivy League law school to admit women.
Mm-hmm. Because yes, okay. And did you have any mentors in law school?
I had a lot of good friends in law school that I'm still friendly with throughout my life. But I didn't really have any. I didn't have any real good mentors at that time. No, it was a lot of work, man. It was a lot. It was very hard.
Mm-hmm. Did you focus on a particular area of study in law school?
Um, Not really. You had a lot of required courses.
Mm-hmm.
The first year was all required courses, and excuse me, the second and third year, I took criminal law, which everybody didn't take, and you had to take civil procedure. And I was interested in real estate law. I took that. I was a teaching fellow in real estate law. So uh,
What does
uh,
being a teaching fellow entail? Was that during your time at law school?
yes, you graded some of the exams, and you participate teaching some of the smaller classes. There weren't a lot of clinics in those days. It was all classroom,
Mm-hmm.
pretty much all classroom stuff. I think law school has changed a lot.
Mm-hmm.
It's been a while since I went to law school, so I hope it has changed.
In what ways do you hope it has changed? Just the clinic stuff?
Well, yeah, I hope that you have more clinic stuff that you more hands-on. I mean, I remember thinking to myself when I graduated from law school and I was looking for a job, I didn't think I knew too much at that point. Uh, and I kept saying to myself, I hope doctors know more about medicine than I know about law when they graduate, because I don't know much of anything. I felt rather undereducated. But what law school is about is teaching you how to think and analyze.
Mhm. How did you spend your time outside of class in the library?
Well, I played a lot of bridge. I had a lot of friends. We would go to some museums, and we had a pretty good time.
Great. Were there any clubs at law school? Any
I don't
extracurricular clubs?
I don't remember any particular clubs, no. But we did a lot of people did more cooking, and there weren't the number of restaurants wasn't like it is now. If you were going to have a party, you prepared the food yourself, and we had a lot of get-togethers.
Mhm.
It was
Do you,
fun, and we went to a lot of demonstrations.
mhm. Do you recall any big hurdles in law school in particular, aside from just the daily, workload challenges?
Well, when it came to getting a job, when you started doing on-campus interviews, there were a lot of issues involved with that because some employers didn't want to interview certain categories of people, like women, and the law school was came to the conclusion after being pushed a little bit by the students that they couldn't do that. They had to interview everybody who wanted to be interviewed. They couldn't control the hiring, of course, but everybody had to be in.
So
And
at first, the school administration was kind of allowing the employers to not to be selective about the groups of people that they wanted to interview, and then soon they changed that policy.
right,
Okay. And so during your time there, did that affect your time there? Or had the
yes,
policy changed by then?
no, it was in flux at that time. I was one of the women that we demonstrated against it, demanded equal access, and we got it.
What did you do to demonstrate or demand? Did you go to the head of the school?
Yeah, we went on strike a couple of times, shut down the classes, things like that. As I remember, I honestly don't remember, but they reacted to it. I think they thought it was the right thing to do.
Hmm.
you know.
And you mentioned you were segregated during the bar exam for being a woman. Can
Yes.
can you describe what you mean by that?
What I mean by that? Well, at that time, the bar exam took place at different locations. They used different hotels, ballrooms in different hotels. And the hotel I was in, all of the people who were taking the exam consisted of women, people who had prior felony convictions, or people who had failed the exam and were retaking it. So it was this group of people that you know were set apart. They knew who they were, and every third person in that room was a woman.
Okay.
And at that
So
time, for example, in Pennsylvania, African Americans were segregated for the bar exam. I mean, this was going on all over the country. It was a very different life then, you know.
did they ever give you a reason for segregating the women, or
Yes,
it would
the reason was that they would have to hire extra proctors to oversee the bathroom to make sure you weren't cheating. And that would cost an additional $75 a day for the 2 days of the exam.
so having the men and women together, they would need more proctors and having the women separate? Okay.
Yeah.
So there were proctors for your exam as well, right? The women's
Oh,
section,
yeah. Oh, yeah.
women,
In the bathroom, there were proctors too. In the exam area, in the bathrooms, yeah.
were they
'Cause I
women
guess
proctors?
I imagine they were if they were in the women's bathroom. Yeah. Did you
Wow.
have proctors for your exam?
Yeah, yeah, the LSAT. Hmm. But I have yet to take the bar, so.
Uh,
So how did it feel to be segregated during the bar exam?
well, people were pissed off about it, because it what was claimed in the lawsuit was that the women were scored more harshly than men to pass the bar
And why was that alleged?
because they could tell that women did better in law. Women, generally speaking, performed better in law school than the men at higher grades and had a lower pass rate.
Really?
Yeah.
Okay, wow. So the women were the was there a different so there was a different grading scale for the men and the women,
Well,
essentially.
that was the
That was
allegation.
the
And
allegation.
it was that you could tell. So you're supposed to be anonymous. You're supposed to get a number. But if you know that you have number 550 to 750 in one space and every third person's a woman, you know who they are, right?
Hmm. So they did that on purpose. It was among the post or ex-felons, you said ex-convicts.
Right.
And so they made sure that it was women were every third person. Okay. And who filed the lawsuit?
A group of women who had graduated the year before and taken the bar and were segregated.
Wow.
And they came to some of us and asked us to sign affidavits to support the action, which I did.
Hmm. Now, you graduated in 1971, and
Mhm.
can you walk us through the application process for your first job?
Well, I decided I wanted to be a legal services lawyer. Well, actually, I did do some interviewing in law while I was in law school. That another action was an outgrowth of that, uh, which a group of women sued some of the major firms for discrimination and actually prevailed in that lawsuit. But I decided I was going to be a legal services lawyer. Uh, you couldn't get a job as a prosecutor. They didn't want women. Uh, I didn't want to be a prosecutor anyway. Uh, so I started applying to various legal services offices. That was civil legal services at that time. Um, and I had this really annoying experience. My first interview was with Harlem Legal Services. So I go to Harlem Legal Services and I get there. They interview me and they tell me, oh, it was really great. We would really like to hire you, but we hired somebody else for this job just last week. So I was very, disappointed. I went home and you know, it didn't occur to me to say at that time, well, why didn't you call me and cancel the interview? You know, 'cause
So you think that they made, sorry,
go
you
ahead.
think they made up that reason on the spot once they met you?
Yeah, I think I didn't fit their profile, or whatever that profile was. Oh, I had applied actually by, you know, with I applied to Rosebud Indian Legal Services for a job. I applied to Maryland Legal Services for a job. I was turned down by everyone. Maryland did offer me a job as a secretary, though. Rosebud Legal Services told me they didn't have women there because it was too dangerous. Um, and my parents, of course, wanted me to come back to Massachusetts. I wasn't going back to.
Did the employer who said it was too dangerous, did they give a reason?
That was Rosebud Legal Services. It was too dangerous on the reservation, they said, for
What
a
did you
woman.
think of that?
I was angry about it, but wasn't much I could do about it. And so then I got an interview at Brooklyn Legal Services, which was way out in Brooklyn. So I took all these subways and I got there and I had this very nice interview. And the person interviewing said to me, it was really bizarre. You know, you're terrific and would love to hire you, but we hired somebody else for this job. So I went back and I was again downtrodden and crestfallen, you know. So then I had a job interview at Bronx Legal Services. And I get up there and I get interviewed by Bronx Legal Services. And the guy interviewing me, there were two men interviewing me. He said, one of them said to me, you know, you're terrific, would love to hire you. But yesterday we hired somebody for this job. I had it. I just lit into them. And I said, you have some nerve to drag me all the way up here after you hired them. How can you do that? That's not right. And I just went on and on about how rude they were and how ridiculous this was. And how you should be ashamed of yourselves. You're going to pay for me to get back. How am I going to get back? I went on and on. And they said, okay, we're going to fire that person you hired.
Wow.
Well, it was ridiculous because it was bullshit. You know, they didn't want this, whatever I was to them, whatever it was about me that nobody wanted. They didn't want me, you know. So I
Mhm.
got the job and I loved it.
That's
Uh,
great. Did what did that job entail?
we represented people in landlord tenant court, adolescents in family court, juvenile delinquency proceedings, and a couple of other sort of related actions. I ended up in federal court one day, federal district court, which was a funny experience because it was a sad case. Uh, this young soldier had died, and when someone died in the military at that time, the family got a $10,000 life insurance policy. But he had a child. He wasn't married to the mother of the child, and she intervened. She wanted the life insurance policy. So it was a stakeholder action in federal court. And I go downtown to federal court, which was a big deal. I mean, it's a big deal. I'm not even admitted to the bar, by the way. I had passed the bar exam. But in the appellate division has what they call a practice order, which allows employees of the district attorney's offices, legal services, legal aid to practice until they're admitted, as long as they pass the bar. So I go down and I tell this judge, I said, you know, apparently I didn't know it, but this judge was supposed to be a very nasty, mean man. Uh, he had been a very famous football player when he was young, 10 blocks of granite or something. I wasn't into that. Anyway, so I said to him, you know, I'm not admitted to, and everybody looks at me and he said, you mean you're not admitted to federal court? He said, we can take care of that. I said, no, judge, I'm not admitted to anything. And everybody stops. They said, well, what are you doing here? I said, so I explained about the practice. He said, okay, that's fine. And then he says to me, you have to come back on this particular date. I said, well, I can't come back that day, judge. I have to, I said, I'm going on a trip to Italy. And everybody in the court is like stunned. So, oh, okay. So what's a good time for you? What's a good date? And he settled the case too. The next time I showed up, he was so nice to me. I don't know, you never figured out why, but maybe because, and I was the only female lawyer in the whole place, the only one in the courtroom. And
In the entire courtroom, including everyone in.
including everybody, including the clerks, including everybody. I was the only woman there. And I wasn't going to misrepresent what I was, certainly. I wasn't going to say I was admitted if I wasn't. And I felt he should know that. Yeah. So
How
anyway,
did
that
that
was what.
feel? How did that feel to be the only woman in the courthouse and talk to, talk to the judge and tell him what's what?
It felt I was nervous and anxious about it, but I figured he was fair. I expected people to be fair to me, and I did get half of the insurance policy for the child, and the parents got the other half, which worked out. Now that's not money, but then it was money. You know, it was sad because the father he fell off of a dock and drowned or something like that. It's very sad. But,
Mhm.
but I had a bunch of experiences. One day I was representing this tenants group, and there were a lot of parties involved. The tenants were on rent strike. And there was the landlord's lawyers, the insurance company, a bunch of whole people. There had to be about 6 different lawyers involved. I was the only woman, and we're trying to settle the case. And of course, they didn't want the tenants. The other lawyers wanted to shut the tenants out as much as possible, because they wanted to work out whatever was going to happen between the owner of the building and the insurance companies. At that time, you wouldn't know, probably don't know this about history, but the Bronx was burning. A lot of buildings were being burned down in the Bronx in the 1970s. Very interesting movie about that right now, that was made by some people who experienced it. And the building that I was representing had had a fire in it, and et cetera, et cetera. So I was involved, and I was putting my 2 cents in on this discussion. And I guess I was irritating them because they all picked up and went into the men's room, bathroom.
All of your adversary attorneys,
Yeah, went into the men's
how
bathroom.
long were they in there?
Not too long. I went in. I
You said
thought
you
I
went
went.
in?
Well, darn right, I went in. I wasn't going to let him go. I mean, that you can't allow that. So they came out when I went in.
Wow,
There was no other place. Huh?
how did that feel?
I felt that I did the right thing. I mean, they were wrong. They shouldn't have tried to exclude me from the discussions, and it was amateurish. Yeah. Well,
Wow.
anyway, we worked things out after that. Uh, but
Were most of your adversary attorneys like that, or was that kind of rare?
no, they were all kind of nasty.
And
They were
they were mostly men, all
they
men?
were almost all men. Yes, there were a number of women who were legal aid attorneys or legal services attorneys, but the attorneys that represented the insurance company, the landlords, were all men. And as I said, this was a very difficult time. There were literally, the Bronx was burning. I mean, buildings were being burned down. It
What
was terrible.
exactly was causing the burning?
Well, some people say that the landlords were putting their buildings on fire to collect the insurance. There were groups of tenants that were very active, and the buildings weren't being properly taken care of. It was a time of great social unrest.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And do you recall any major triumphs early on in your career, aside from the ones you already mentioned? Do any others stand out?
Well, I won a few cases for my clients, about getting repairs and those kinds of things. I mean, there were some funny experiences that you had,
Mm-hmm.
but most of the people were, you know, our office was in a place in the Bronx that was considered to be a very dangerous neighborhood. And I had to take a subway and a bus to get there. And nobody ever did anything or attempted to do anything to me that wasn't, was nobody tried to rob me or mug me or anything.
You felt
And they,
safe on your way to work.
Yeah, I did. I did feel safe. Maybe I was foolish, but I did.
You began working as a law assistant to the Board of Justices at the New York Supreme Court next, correct?
That's right.
And how did you get that job?
I was uh, I was involved in a political campaign, and I went on election day. I went to the courthouse to represent people who weren't allowed to vote. And the candidate's campaign who I was involved in was a Hispanic person. Uh, and all of these Hispanic people were getting turned away. So they were having these hearings and uh, about whether they were properly registered, were they, et cetera, et cetera. Most of them were Puerto Rican background, so they were legally able to vote in the United States. So the judge I was appearing in front of, I did a couple of hearings, and he said, "Excellent presentation, Miss Mazzarelli, but your application is denied." So this went on for a while. I guess I have a big mouth. I don't know. So finally, I said to him, "If I'm so good at this and I'm presenting such a good case, how come I never win?"
How did he respond?
He looked at me and he said to me, "Application denied, but if you ever want a job, let me know. We have jobs downtown in the Supreme Court." And it turned out he was the administrative judge, and he hired me. About a year or so later, I decided it was time for a change because the legal services job was very, wearing on you. So I went down. The guy hired me.
Were
So
there,
that's how I got that job.
and what did that role entail?
What I did was, there were judges. All the different judges had different assignments, and the way they did it in those days, all of the motions and all the cases were heard in what they called the special motion term, and groups of us were assigned on a rotating basis, and you did all the motions for that week, and then it took you a couple of weeks to finish them, and then you would go back, and so you worked for all the different judges in the courthouse essentially over time.
And were
Uh,
the judges mostly men or
Mostly, yeah, there were two women,
two women?
2 or 3 women, yeah. One lady was they were interesting women. It was a struggle for them to get where they were.
Did you spend a lot of time with them, like equal time among all the judges, or some more than others?
Some more than others, just because of the rotation, it worked out.
Mhm.
But the judges then were very interesting people. One had been the prosecutor on the Rosenbergs case. Do you know who the Rosenbergs were?
I don't.
The Rosenbergs were a couple that were accused of treason, and were convicted in federal court and executed in the 50s. So read about it. It's very controversial.
I will.
Yeah.
So
Uh,
you saw that case?
no, the one of the judges at that time had been the prosecutor
Oh, wow.
on the Rosenberg case. Yeah. But there were people who had big, big life stories. One guy had been the judge who said to me, one of job. He'd been the ambassador to Liberia. He was an African American guy. He'd been the ambassador to Liberia. He'd been the borough president. They had real political um, lives and histories.
Hmm. And the appellate division designated you as a special referee on election law in 1977, correct?
Correct.
And what was the designation process like?
You're designated.
Just like that?
Yeah, go do this case. So I guess they checked you out,
Yeah. Hmm.
without my knowing it. But and then I eventually, yeah.
And yeah, can you describe your role there in the appellate division?
Well,
And
I wasn't even. We did the hearings in the Board of Elections. We were sent from Manhattan to the Bronx, and lawyers from the Bronx were sent to Manhattan, so there wasn't, any conflict of interest allegations. And we did the hearings right at the Board of Elections as to whether you have to sign petitions to get on on the ballot, whether the signatures were valid and taken validly, and et cetera, et cetera. And then you would write a report and make a recommendation to the court, and the court would decide whether to accept your recommendation or not.
Did you enjoy that role?
It was interesting, yeah.
And in 1978, you moved on to principal law assistant to Judge William McCoo at the New York Supreme Court.
Right.
How did you get this job?
He, I had worked for all the different judges, and he asked me if I wanted to do it.
Mhm.
I didn't like that as much as I like moving around, though.
Mhm.
So I stayed there for about a couple, I think 2.5 years or so. And then I went into private practice.
So what influenced your decision to move into private practice?
I wanted to change. I wanted to see what it was like. And it was interesting. I had two partners, two other women. There weren't any other women law firms in those days. So we had a good business. But I learned a lot. We represented a lot of people who were in the arts. Uh,
Oh, in the
that's
art.
what?
Sorry, what does that entail? Like artists and musicians?
Artists, architects, dancers, mostly gay people. We had mostly gay guys as clients. And, just they had the same problems everybody else has. So it was very interesting and very hard because I wasn't so good at collecting money and, dunning people. I didn't like that. Yelling at secretaries, I didn't like that. So, well, but I like
So
the practice of law.
you started that firm, correct, with two of your partners?
Right.
And how did you all decide compensation? Was it equal?
We used different models as time went on,
Mhm.
depending on whose client it was, whether we were going to share it all or not. Of course, we had to cover expenses. That was the
Mhm.
first.
Did you enjoy working with only women leadership? It
I
was
enjoyed, it wasn't specifically that they were women. I enjoyed working with smart lawyers. I enjoyed that. And I enjoyed the client contact, but I didn't like having to collect the money. I didn't like the business aspects. That was not my forte. I didn't like having to chide the secretaries. Ignore that. That's my landline. It's always spam. Um, I didn't like that part of it. So I decided I would get into politics and maybe run for judge. I thought I could do that job,
Mhm.
and I
And
would like that.
before we get into that part of your career, I wanted to ask you a little bit about your experiences dating and getting married. When you were younger, did you see yourself getting married?
No,
Why not?
at that time, a lot of women didn't. You know,
For what reasons?
you wanted independence. You wanted your own name. There was, women's liberation movement was on the way there. And you wanted that independence to make your own decisions.
When you say at that time women didn't want to get married, are you referring to the early 80s?
70s, late 70s, early 80s, yeah.
And did you date much before the 80s? Did you when you were like a young girl, did you ever see yourself getting married? Did you date in high school?
I didn't date much in high school, no.
Hmm.
In college, people went out in groups more than anything. And in law school, I dated a little bit. I had a boyfriend in high school, but it never was really serious. I mean, uh, he actually went off to Vietnam. Uh,
Mm.
uh, but yeah, I dated moderately. Yeah.
Hmm. And you ultimately did get married, correct?
Yes, I'm married. Yeah.
And how
But
did
I didn't get married until I was 55 years old. Can you believe that?
you how did you meet your husband?
I met my husband at a bar association.
A fellow lawyer?
Hello, lawyer, right?
Mhm. And did you and your husband have children?
I was 55. he had children already. I didn't have any children. I was too old to have children, but
Mhm.
so he has two children and my stepchildren.
Mhm. And moving back into your career as you pivoted towards public service, in 1985, you were elected to the bench in the criminal division of civil court in the city of New York, correct?
I was elected in a regular election. I had to go out in the street and campaign. And I always remember one day this person said to me, you don't look like a judge. And I said to them, well, tell me what a judge looks like. Well, they're taller. You're very short. They're taller than you are, and they're men. And I said, oh, and the person said, I'm bigger than, I'm going to vote for you. So anyway, I did win that election by in New York City, the Democratic primary is where the person is actually selected. So the primary election was the main one that you had to win. Uh, and I did win it, not by a lot of votes.
So
333 votes I won by.
did you expect to win, or were you
No,
surprised by the result?
I think I was almost more surprised than the guy who lost to me.
And how did it feel to win?
Felt good. Very surprising, a little intimidating. I was surprised. Everybody told me I was going to lose. So, but I didn't. I worked very hard, very, very hard on that campaign. Every morning I would get up and go to a subway. How you do it is you go to the subway stop and you hand out literature. Yeah, and it was a
And
process. First, I had to get on the ballot. I had to get signatures. Had to go through signature challenge, and it was very cumbersome.
and were you also working at the time, or was this a full-time
Yes,
job to campaign?
I was working.
Did you campaign before the workday essentially?
Yeah. Well, you go to the subway stop when people are going to work.
Hmm.
Yeah.
And what was your campaign platform?
That I had a good background and I was devoted to justice and equality and time for a woman, and uh, that was basically my platform.
What did the makeup of the bench in New York City look like in 1985 in your
In
courthouse?
1985, actually, there was a study done by some group, and was, I think the average age was 61 white males, mostly 61-year-old white males.
Okay.
But
That
it
was
was
the
changing.
majority
It was changing.
demographic.
Yeah, yeah.
Hmm. Did you were there any other women on the bench?
Yes, in Manhattan, there were some women on the bench.
Hmm. And
Manhattan has always had the most number of women.
mhm.
I made some notes here. Let me see if I.
In 1988, you were appointed to the New York Supreme Court. And what did that process look like of getting appointed?
Well, first I was elected to the civil court, and then I was sent by assignment to sit in the criminal court. Um, and I didn't really have a criminal legal background, so I had to learn a lot, sort of while I was doing it, and that was interesting. I enjoyed that, and I took to it pretty well. It was a very high volume. As you can imagine, Manhattan criminal court in the 80s, crime was very high here, and
Mhm.
it was a difficult time. But women always have to struggle to be taken seriously. I just remember this experience so clearly. The courtroom I had was underneath pens in the courthouse, underneath where prisoners were kept, and somebody stuffed up a toilet and flooded my courtroom. And anyway, as a result of this flood, the tiles in my courtroom were all twisted and uneven, and I thought in a rather unsafe condition for people to walk around in. So we had weekly meetings. I brought this up every week for a couple of weeks. And then I went on vacation for a week. No, and nothing was ever done. I went on vacation for a week and I came back and all of a sudden the floor had been fixed. And I inquired what had happened. And the guy who had replaced me had brought up the situation of the floor. And when he told them, they fixed it.
Wow.
Isn't that interesting?
Mm-hmm.
And
How long had it been since you first made that suggestion until,
about 5 weeks.
wow.
But people just don't always listen. And that's true now too. They don't always listen to you.
Mm-hmm.
They just make an assumption, you know.
Mm-hmm. And then how did did your role change much from being in civil court to being in New York Supreme Court? You said it was criminal at first and then civil.
Well, first I was in the lower criminal court, and then I was assigned as an acting Supreme Court justice, and I went to the Bronx and I did what's called the narcotics part of the drug part, and then I did that in Manhattan also. And then I asked for a reassignment to a trial part, and I started to try felonies, which was very educational and very interesting. And then eventually I got elected to the Supreme Court in 91. I got elected and I started in 1992.
Mm-hmm.
And in 1992, I was assigned to a civil trial part. And I stayed there for 2 years. And then I went to the appellate division. I was very lucky.
How did it feel to achieve that appointment by the governor?
Quite extraordinary. It was Mario Cuomo. Have you ever heard of Mario Cuomo?
Mm-hmm.
I was his last appointment, his last day in office.
Ooh. Was
Yeah.
there a reason for that that he'd made that appointment on the final day?
Well, I guess he liked to keep people waiting. I don't know. Maybe he probably had other things he had to attend to. Uh, but he had lost re-election.
Mm-hmm.
And this was his last. He appointed me to the what's called the first department, and this other fellow to the third department, I believe. The state of New York is divided into 4 sections, what they call departments. Each section has an appellate division, and then the high court is what's called the Court of Appeals in Albany,
Mm-hmm.
and Supreme Court in New York State is a trial court.
Mm-hmm.
And other places it's the top court. But
yeah,
the
New York's
reason,
a little different than the other states.
because New York State Supreme Court were the first courts in the colonies.
Oh, I didn't know that.
Yeah, that's where it comes from. And there were all these little courts in villages and towns. And then when they developed the Supreme Court, it was over all of those courts. So they called it the Supreme Court. But it's the oldest
That makes
trial court in the country.
Mm-hmm. And what was the composition of the appellate judges? Mostly men? Or
There were 14 men and there was 1 woman. And then when I went, there were 2 women. Yeah, but she was great. We're still very good friends. She's still alive. She's 94. She's a Spitfire. She used to say to me, "Don't worry, Angie. The odds are even. The 2 of us, the odds are even."
Did you ever feel like there was a divide between you and the other woman judge and the rest of the men judges?
Well, I think the divide was more in terms of how you looked at the law rather than the gender. I mean, I think gender plays a little bit into how you look at the law, but it doesn't actually determine it, really. I mean, but I never felt that the men were discriminating against us because we were women. I never felt that. They were always very respectful, and we all, it's a hard job. You work very hard in that court, and they respected. We were prepared. We knew what we were doing.
Mm-hmm.
And the other woman who was there was incredibly able to convince them. Consensus. I by the time I left, I was good at getting consensus too. That's a talent that you have to develop.
Mm-hmm. And you started this position in 1994 and you retired in
I started in December 30th, 1994.
right at the end of
Yeah,
1994.
yeah, yeah.
And you retired in 2022, and you
Mhm.
were the longest serving female justice in the appellate division and
Mhm.
the third longest serving appellate division justice, period.
Right.
So how did it feel to retire?
Well, I still wish I was there, but that's the way it is. I'm still very friendly with a number of the judges, and I am involved with some of the things in the court. I just was made the chairperson of the court mediation and program. We have a program where we try to settle cases, or at least settle the appeal prior to it going on the calendar. And we do achieve that in about 200 cases a year, which helps with the burden of the burden of the appeals. We have a whole group of mediators who are extraordinarily well qualified. Mediation is becoming more common now. There are a number of people who that's what they do. Their whole practice is mediation. And I'm also co-chair of what's called the Character and Fitness Committee, which oversees the admission of lawyers.
Is that a disciplinary role?
No, it's admission. I
Oh,
have, we have a separate group, Attorney Grievance Committee, it's called, that disciplines lawyers. And I did one hearing for them since I left the bench. It was a long hearing, involved hearing uh, on the lawyer. But these two programs don't involve disciplining counsel.
mhm. Your contributions to the legal profession have established numerous precedents. For example, you wrote many appellate division decisions about safety requirements in the construction area of labor law. Going back to that story that we referenced earlier, can you share that experience for us about how your contributions were recognized by that law professor?
Oh, that one, yeah. He said, "Oh, I was at some kind of a state bar association meeting, and he came up. He said, "Oh, I wanted to meet you." He said, "I always thought your name they were misspelling your name, and it had to be Angelo." I said, "What?" He said, "Yes." He said, "Because you write so many construction cases. It's the statute here is called 241 of the labor law, 240 sub one." He said, "You write so many 240 sub one cases." He said, "I thought you had to be a man." I said, "Well, I'm not." He said, "Well, was your dad in construction? Was your father in construction?" And I just found that to be, from a law professor, to be so almost bizarre, you know. I had represented a lot of architects and designers in my practice, but I could decide a case. Construction isn't such a mystery, you know. So that's
Mhm,
that's like the story you wanted.
mhm. Yeah. We started this interview with me describing you as a respected attorney, compassionate judge, and the longest serving female justice in the appellate division of the New York State Supreme Court. How would you describe yourself in 3 words?
Oh gosh. um, I've lived a very good life. I've had a lot of wonderful opportunities. I've met a lot of very interesting people who've been very kind to me, and you don't get anywhere by yourself, and you really have to appreciate the advantages that you have and try to use them in a positive way to help people. I think. I hope I've done that. I hope I've helped some people, and you know you often think of mistakes you might have made or whatever, but I'd like to think that overall I've done something positive for the citizens.
Looking back on all you've experienced and achieved, what makes you most proud of your younger self?
Younger self, that I just kept at it.
Hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah, you provided many examples of when you kind of spoke to powerful people and told them what was really on your mind.
I wish I did it more often, actually, but I just, those instances I told you about, just wasn't right. That just wasn't right what they were doing, and I had the sense that it had nothing to do with my ability, and that they hadn't really hired somebody else. Uh, you know, there still is a lot of discrimination against women, and our society right now is going through such a change, and whether or not people should express those things and act on those, or you really women have to understand that the strides that women of my age made, are not permanent. You have to keep fighting for them. And, as more women go into the profession, you have to make sure that the profession maintains the same level of respect, that you're getting paid the same, you're earning the same money, and that you really have to sort of bring some of the, I think women in general grow up with maybe an ability to have a little more empathy than men. It's men being empathetic sometimes is frowned on. But we have to make the world better, not just achieve for ourselves, but give a positive contribution uh, to the profession.
Mhm. As we close our interview, I would like to thank you so much for sharing your story with me and our audience today. It was an honor to speak with you, and I'm so excited for the impact your story will have. Thank you for
Well,
joining me today.